So after about a month of intensive data collection, it's finally time to start looking at the data and answering some questions. I spent approximately 21 hours playing around 150 multiplayer matches and collected over 12,000 records of brain data. Looking back at my original questions, I think I'm finally at a point where I can now answer most of them. The first question is, can I read my own brain data? And if so, is the data valid? And the answer to that question is yes. Well, I mean, to the extent that the MindFlex is actually providing valid brain data, that is, and that's still somewhat debatable. But I did some baseline experiments that seem to indicate that there's like something to the data. Now, the MindFlex claims to read your actual brain waves, and it provides the values for the individual bands, like your delta, your theta, etc. But those values, they're not provided in hertz, as they would be with like a real medical grade EEG. Instead, they provide what they call ASIC EEG power int values. Now, NeuroSky, who are the makers of the chip inside the MindFlex, state that these values would typically be reported in units such as like volts squared per hertz. But since our values have undergone a number of complicated transforms and rescale operations from the original voltage measurements, there's no longer a simple linear correlation of units to volts. Now, they go on to say that the data is only meaningful compared to each other and to themselves, and it would, quote, not necessarily be meaningful or correct to directly compare them to, say, values output by another EEG system. In their currently output form, they are useful as an indication of whether each particular band is increasing or decreasing over time, and how strong each band is relative to the other bands. Now, they also mention that for display purposes, if you'd like to remove the exponential gaps between the bands to make them appear closer to each other, you could display the logarithm of each value instead of the actual exponential values. And honestly, they're right. It does make the bands appear closer and it improves their readability, so that's how I decided to display the bands in my reports. Now, to me, the most useful part of the data that they provided is the addition of what they call attention and meditation values. These are output on a scale of 1 to 100, and they're the result of some internal calculations based on NeuroSky's proprietary algorithms within the microcontroller on the module within the MindFlex. So, bottom line, it's not a medical grade EEG, but it does provide data that indicates your general level of attention and calmness. And that's fair enough in my book. It makes my life easier when it comes to trying to gauge those specific factors, since I'm not a neuroscientist. Okay, back to my baseline experiments. So, for my baseline experiments, I captured my brain data while performing various activities, and these activities were intended to really establish like the validity of the data and just provide like a baseline for comparison purposes later on. For example, in one experiment, I tracked my brain data during a somewhat boring work meeting, and I observed that my average attention level was in the mid 40% range, and my average meditation or calmness level was around 50%. Now, that's a much higher quantification than I would have expected based on how much I feel like I'm actually paying attention during some work meetings, but I digress. Now, conversely, I captured my brain data during several actual meditation sessions. And this was pretty interesting. I observed a significant decrease in my attention levels, like low 30% numbers, and a noticeable increase in my meditation values, above 70% at times. Now, I also performed a capture playing various online memory type games, and I observed attention levels in like the mid 60% range. Now again, there certainly seems to be something to this data. It doesn't seem like pseudo-random gibberish. So, more questions. Can I improve my performance in video games by being super hyper-focused and concentrating? If I'm distracted, will I play poorly? And will a bad game be visible in my brain activity? Now, these questions are a little bit harder to answer. It's difficult to say whether or not I can directly influence my performance by like really super focused concentrating. And honestly, maybe I didn't quite think through the questions. It's really hard to force yourself to concentrate while playing a video game. The very act of trying to concentrate, at least for me, is itself distracting. So I can't really say if it's possible to improve my performance by concentrating, but what I can do is look at the data and see if there's any patterns that appear to support my theory. Before we look at that, let's quickly talk about what factors I decided would indicate a, quote, good performance. Now, your first thought might be that simple wins and losses would be a good factor to judge my performance. But since most of the game modes in Call of Duty are like team-based modes, I kind of determined that wins and losses aren't really the proper metric to determine my performance. Also, my win-loss ratio is pretty garbage because I mostly play with random teams instead of a party. I tend to lose a lot. So instead of wins and losses, I decided to look at other factors, like my personal kill death and elimination death, commonly known as KD or ED ratios. A few other metrics that can be considered are things like my score, kills per minute, accuracy, those kind of things. I figured those would be better metrics to gauge my actual good performance on. So what does the data show? Let's look at some results from a few of the reports that I wrote to combine and analyze the data. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I pulled all of my Call of Duty stats from the undocumented Call of Duty API. Once I had those stats, I simply combined them with my captured brain activity based on the brain and the match start and end timestamps. So when the match started, I took all the brain records, and when it ended, I stopped taking the records from the brain activity. So first up, attention. I grouped my stats based on average attention range. 0 to 10%, 11 to 20%, etc. Now, out of the 20 plus hours that I tracked, this is the amount of time I spent in the various ranges. As you can see, I spent literally no time playing in the 1 to 20% or the 81 to 100% range, and well over 95% of my time playing in the 31 to 60% range. 61 to 70 might even be a little questionable since it's such a small sample size, so if I do consider it, it would definitely be with a rather large grain of salt. Now, my hypothesis stated that the more focused I was, the better I would perform. However, if it's to be believed, the data tells a different story. My KD and ED results start low when my attention is low, and increase until they peak in the 41 to 50% range. They drop in the 51 to 60% range, increase again slightly in the 61 to 70% range. But as I said about that range, it's a very small sample size, like less than 5% of the time. So that might be argued as an anomaly, and as I said, big grain of salt. Right? Now, this is interesting to me because I hypothesized that there would be a corresponding increase in performance and attention. So the data seems to disprove my hypothesis. But in hindsight, this actually makes sense to me. You know, first-person shooters require attention and focus, but paying too much attention is usually detrimental. Ask any gamer what's going on in their brain when they have a really good match, and they'll probably tell you that they're like locked in mentally, but not hyper visually focused. Instead, you almost tend to like zone out and just let your eyes and your ears and your brain just observe the entire picture. Instead of visually scanning the screen looking for enemies, you tend to do best when you place your visual focus on your crosshairs, and keep your ears open, listening for footsteps and those kind of things. You almost have to intentionally not focus on every little detail happening on the screen and just really let your brain react to like the minor changes in the environment that might indicate the presence of an enemy. And then once you detect that, you redirect your crosshairs in reaction to that visual or the auditory stimuli. If you explicitly try to aim and shoot, you're often going to miss the target. You tend to play best when you're reactive instead of proactive. Now, my score per minute data shows a similar trend, with a low score per minute for low attention ranges, rising again to that peak in the 41 to 50% range, and then falling with increased attention. Kills per minute follows the same trend, maybe not quite as drastically, but you can definitely see the same trend. Now, accuracy is an odd W-shaped graph, but the 31 to 60% range, where I spent 95% of my time playing, follows that same trend. Start low, peak, and then decrease. My best gaming happens when my attention is in that 41 to 50% range. If I pay more attention, I actually do worse. Very interesting stuff. So let's move on to meditation. I didn't really state anything explicitly about calmness in my hypothesis, but I did hypothesize that distractions would lead to poor performance. Is there a relationship between calmness and distraction? When you're distracted, are you not calm? I don't know, but maybe that's a stretch, maybe there's a relationship there. Either way, the calmness data is actually pretty fascinating. Now, I broke out meditation into the same range of groupings that I did attention. And as you can see, I spent all of my time playing in the 41 to 80% range. 15 minutes in the 71 to 80% range represents less than 0.5% of time, so I'm gonna throw that out of the comparisons. Now, interestingly, the data very clearly shows a decline in my performance when my meditation value or calmness increases. I actually do better when I'm not calm. Now, this actually makes sense. Now, certainly being calm or relaxed would indicate a decrease in reaction time, and slower reflexes mean I die faster and more often. The average score very noticeably follows this trend, as does the score per minute and kills per minute. Now, the calmness or meditation values really do seem to reflect reality. Now, certainly poor gameplay is not increasing my calmness. In other words, there's no way that a bad game is going to make me more calm, right? So I'm going to have to assume that my poor performance is a result of me being too relaxed. Maybe I'm tired. It might be interesting to compare the meditation values to the time of day to see if there's a pattern of increased meditation and decreased game performance late at night when I'm tired and should be going to bed instead of playing Call of Duty. So in addition to looking at the impact of attention and meditation on my performance, I took one more approach and grouped the stats by the ratio of attention to meditation. Now, these were grouped as follows. 99% of the stats fell into the 0.60 to 1.1 attention to meditation range. So we'll just throw out the rest. My KD and ED were best when my attention, which was average 45%, was roughly 70 to 79% of my meditation, which was almost 60%. I'd really like to include the other ranges that I threw out because things get interesting when my attention level is higher than my meditation level, but I really don't think that there's enough data to consider this valid. Interestingly, my score per minute does not follow the KD trend, but it trends upwards the more my attention level approaches the same or higher level as my meditation. The kill per minute graph is a mirror of the score per minute graph. Now, you might think that this is because kills equate to score, but score often includes other factors like objective captures, assists, non-lethal equipment usage, smoke grenades, stun grenades, things like that, kill streaks. All of those things come into the score factor. It's not necessarily just kills, so it's not really a direct relationship like you might think it is. So, is there a direct, measurable relationship between superior gaming performance and high levels of attention? Or are there just too many factors at play? It's hard to say definitively, but there certainly seems to be trends that indicate that my performance relates to my brain activity. When my attention and meditation values are moderate, my game performance is best. When I pay too much attention or I'm too calm, my performance definitely decreases. Now, I've spent a lot of time on this project, from the idea phase to the hardware and software builds to the 20+ hours of data collection. It's been a real passion of mine that spanned several months. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've learned a lot about focus and attention and calmness and how they relate to my video game performance. I've gotten to spend time on things that I'm really passionate about: hardware tinkering, writing software, writing queries, analyzing the data in the cloud. Overall, I'd say that this project was a huge success. If you'd like to learn more about the code behind the project, check out some of the links in the description below. And if you have any insight or things that you'd like to share, or you have an opinion about a different approach or a different way to look at the data, please leave a comment below. And as always, thank you for watching.